Hello, my name's Summer Turner, and the topic of my final paper and presentation are how stress and trauma are related to depression and anxiety disorders. So, I chose this topic because depression and anxiety um, are something that I've struggled with for the past 10 years. And I really want to learn as much about depression and anxiety to help not only myself, but other people. After I graduate, I want to help people as well as myself to be able to cope better and um, be able to overcome these symptoms. So, I also really wanted to look at the trauma aspect of depression and anxiety. And this is because although I have experienced depression and anxiety symptoms for the past 10 years, about 5 years ago, I did go through a pretty traumatic experience, and I found this to kind of be a completely different experience whenever it comes to depression and anxiety. I found the symptoms to be different, and I wanted to learn more about that and how trauma related to depression and anxiety. So, the first thing I wanted to talk about were some solutions or things that therapy can help a person to work on to overcome the experience and to kind of dodge the depression, anxiety, or even PTSD symptoms. So I did find, and it was not my original intent to talk about PTSD, but I did find that whenever you add trauma to depression and anxiety, oftentimes PTSD is involved. So I got to learn more about PTSD. I thought that was pretty cool. Um, let me see here. So adaptive strategies are things that a psychologist or therapist can help a person to overcome their symptoms. And some of these adaptive strategies are positive concentration regarding something other than the negative event that the person has experienced, concentration on action to move past the event experience. So, this can be very little goals throughout a day to help a person overcome depression or anxiety symptoms, or this can be an overall goal that helps a person move forward and kind of past that event, positive reevaluation of the experience or traumatic event, and then minimizing the seriousness of the event. So these things are positive strategies that a person can work on to better themselves after something traumatic. And then maladaptive strategies can actually hinder a person's coping after a traumatic event. These can increase the chances of developing depression and anxiety. They can increase symptoms of depression and anxiety or even PTSD. And these include blaming oneself or others, rumination, um, making the event being more dramatic than it actually is, and then avoidance. So, avoidance is interesting because one study showed that avoidance actually increased more than the other maladaptive strategies. Avoidance increased a person's chances of experiencing depression or anxiety symptoms, even PTSD. But in another study on children, avoidance showed to actually be a positive thing for the child. Avoidance showed that the child overcame the traumatic event easier and actually had less symptoms than a child who did not avoid the experience. And I believe that these children were definitely under the age of 13. I believe 8 to 13 was the age group that the childhood study looked at. So I thought that was really interesting, the contrast between avoidance of children and avoidance of adults after a traumatic experience. Something else I wanted to talk about was the importance of poverty driven areas compared to economically stable areas. So, poverty driven areas have a much higher um, chance of traumatic events happening in the area, but also the population, um, the citizens within the population are shown to have more anxiety, depression, and PTSD symptoms. Some of these reasons can be that the amount of stress, so just not as much money in the area, not as many resources to help people overcome issues can just be much more stressful, and cause that alone can cause depression and anxiety. But also, um, the mental, or not the mental health, but the physical health of the citizens also are not as good as economically stable areas, oftentimes. So, the amount of psychological professionals available within poverty driven areas are much smaller than in bigger areas, so it can be a lot harder for citizens to receive the mental health help that they need. This can be due to just insurance, so money, being able to pay for it, but also transportation, because the mental health facilities can be a lot further away from poverty driven areas compared to economically stable areas, and just overall resources and access to for people to receive the physical and mental help that they sometimes need more of than economically stable areas need. It's just not available, it's just not really an option sometimes. So that's something that essentially could be worked on by um, people, just to help poverty areas to improve. Um, the mental health issue is a big one within itself. Drug use, substance use disorder is also something pretty prominent in these areas, and they all just kind of go hand in hand, even along with the physical health. So that's an issue that should be looked at and worked on. So I did have one study that I thought was really interesting, except for it ended up kind of being an incomplete study. They didn't find really what they were looking for, and this was looked people, mainly women, unfortunately, which was an issue of the study itself because it was pretty biased. But this study looked at mainly women who have experienced at least two traumatic events in their lifetime that actually did not have any depression or anxiety or PTSD symptoms even after they have been through these traumatic events. So they were looked at um to see what helps them, how they naturally overcame the stress of these traumatic events versus somebody who doesn't handle stress and trauma very well at all. So unfortunately, they didn't really find much, but I did think that this study was really interesting. I liked the way, just the interest in it. It was a different way to look at how to help people who do suffer from depression and anxiety. Um, they did find it wasn't significant enough, but they did find that these women who um, had been through the traumatic events were very emotionally regulated. And that did not have a definite, um, I couldn't find it's something that I looked for, but there was no definite definition of emotional regulation. Like what all that consisted of is something I was looking for, and that wasn't really explained very well in the study. But they also had a sense of mindfulness and spirituality that seemed to help them as well. Um, but like I said, it being of mainly educated women did make it biased. The educated women may just overcome things better for different reasons than emotional regulation and mindfulness, since there was no significant um, findings. But I really liked reading about that study. I found it pretty interesting, and I really hope that it was done in 2022, and I really hope that they try again and get a bigger sample, a more diverse sample, and get some more concrete findings through if emotional regulation and mindfulness have a great impact or not, or what does help people better overcome traumatic events. Um, that way, this could change how therapists essentially work on therapy. This could add to the what kind of therapy is done. And all right, so I really enjoyed learning about trauma and how it relates to depression and anxiety. I also learned a lot about PTSD and how that relates to mainly depression, but it does relate to anxiety as well. And yeah, thank you.